Hello, everyone. I hope you are all staying well and healthy. I am Pascaline Dupas, the Faculty Director of the King Center on Global Development here at Stanford University and a Professor of Economics. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are in this speaker series with David Miliband, the President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, or IRC. This speaker series features talks by distinguished scholars and policymakers. Our goal with this series is to foster discussion about successes and challenges in the field of poverty alleviation and development. Let me just say a few words about the King Center. What we hope to do at the King Center is to stimulate research to alleviate global poverty, hoping that the research is going to be useful to inform policy on critical development issues. We recognize that issues are multifaceted and require a multiplicity of approaches, and so we support large-scale faculty initiatives from faculty and students from across the 7 schools on campus. We also convene stakeholders from campus and engage with policymakers and thought leaders in the public and the private sector. For some reason, my slides are not willing to cooperate, so I cannot move on. Okay, here we go, I can move on. So we are, to summarize, a research center working to improve the lives of the world's poor. And one thing that we recognize is that the poverty alleviation is becoming extremely complex because the situations in which the poor live are becoming increasingly complex. The fact that there are fewer extreme poor today than 25 years ago is wonderful news, but they are going to be harder to reach and harder to help because they are more and more the result of conflict, forced migration, and a number of other challenges that are coming along with climate change, obviously being also at the top of our mind. So today we're going to be focusing on one aspect of these complex challenges, the fact that a lot of the poor of today are forcibly moved out of their home by civil conflict. Many have said that we are facing an unprecedented refugee crisis at the moment with close to 80 million refugees around the world. And again, the vast majority of them are hosted by other poor countries, possibly compounding the issue of extreme poverty. So to discuss the impacts of the refugee crisis around the world today and what can be done about it, we have 2 very special guests. I will first start by introducing Jeremy Weinstein, who is Professor of Political Science and the Fisher Family Director of Stanford Global Studies, who will then be introducing David in just a moment. So Jeremy is an eminent scholar. He's worked a lot on civil conflict and insurgency. He's also the co-director and co-founder of the Immigration Policy Lab here at Stanford, and an amazing contributor to university life. And we are extremely honored to have both his expertise and, as a scholar and as a former member of government as well, to join us in this conversation. Before I introduce David, let me just mention how we're going to proceed. We're going to have about an hour to dive into this complex issue. So the way we're going to deal with questions, which we anticipate will be many, is that please, we want you to share them on the Q&A. And then, Jeremy and I will be monitoring the Q&A and weaving your questions into the discussion with David. So please put your questions in the Q&A, and I will now pass the stage to Jeremy to introduce our guest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pascaline. It's such a pleasure to be with you today and with the King Center community, students, faculty, staff, and sort of affiliates in the broader community as we have this really important discussion today about the humanitarian moment that we're in, the challenge of forcibly displaced people around the world, and the role of groups like the International Rescue Committee. It's an honor and pleasure to welcome to the virtual stage with me today, David Miliband. One advantage of this virtual moment, if there is an advantage at all, is that despite his busy schedule, we can grab an hour of his time since it doesn't require an airplane trip. Typically, David would find himself in Yemen or with the Rohingya in the camps or in South Sudan at a moment like this. but he is locked in New York as we are locked in the various places that we're in this challenging moment of the pandemic. And we're really grateful to him for joining us today. To most people on this call, I imagine David doesn't require any introduction. He's the president of one of the world's largest humanitarian organizations, the International Rescue Committee, with more than 30,000 staff and volunteers working in 40 countries around the world and in 20 major US cities. He also had a prior career in government. He's a retired government official like myself. He served as the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom between 2007 and 2010, and was a member of Parliament between 2001 and 2013. But I've had the particular privilege of getting to know David and his team in the context of our shared work on issues of refugee resettlement in the United States. David is the son of refugees who fled continental Europe during World War II, and he's been a tireless advocate for refugees during a period in which far too many countries, including the United States, have begun to close their doors. He's been an innovative thinker in considering how to build political support for the resettlement of refugees and thinking about how to change our models of programming to improve outcomes for refugees, and in using his platform to grow the number of countries around the world that are engaged in providing a safe home for refugees who can't return to where they come from. And so it's been a period of extraordinary challenge, but one where we've all been grateful for David's leadership and the platform that he has at the International Rescue Committee. So David, welcome to Stanford virtually. We wish we could have you in person, but we're looking forward to this conversation.
Jeremy, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the professor, to Pascaline as well. I wish I was in California, don't we all? But very nice to be able to share this discussion with you, which I'm looking forward to.
Great, terrific. So I'm going to open with a question, David, about the moment in which we find ourselves. You know, as I said in the introduction, you lead one of the major humanitarian organizations in the world. And even before the world was hit by the COVID pandemic, we were experiencing a set of challenges in the humanitarian space that were of extraordinary scope. An all-time high in the number of refugees and forcibly displaced people, a number of long-standing civil wars and crises, and a humanitarian caseload that vastly outstripped the availability of resources and capacity. And I wonder if you can share with us from the perch that you have, how has the pandemic affected the humanitarian landscape? And what has this demanded of you and your team in trying to respond to the current moment?
Yeah, well, look, let's define the moment. First of all, it's a moment where, as the professor said, extreme poverty is now majority concentrated in fragile and conflict states. Just to be clear, the 80 million figure is not just refugees, it's refugees and the internally displaced. There are 45 million internally displaced, 30 million refugees, 3.5, 4 million asylum seekers. That's how you get to the 80 million figure. And those people are the product of a failure of diplomacy. There are failure of diplomacy in Syria, most obviously, but long-standing conflicts in Somalia, Afghanistan, Northeast Nigeria, untended conflicts that have produced record numbers of people fleeing. More than 1% of the world's population now forced from their homes by conflict, persecution, or disaster. And so immediately you have a geopolitical lens as well as a humanitarian lens for what we're facing at this moment. Now, there's a couple of other trends that are vital to this moment. It's a moment where the geopolitics is, let's be honest, it's increasingly nationalist. The global system is weak, not strong, and it's weakening, not strengthening. So even pre-COVID, you had a weakening international system. You had a kind of zero-sum mentality, which I think is the difference between nationalism and patriotism. Patriotism is positive-sum, but nationalism is zero-sum. And that's an important part of the geopolitics. You know that well in the US. But obviously my own country, I'm, as you may gather from my accent, you were kind enough and diplomatic enough not to mention this, but although I live in New York, I'm not from Brooklyn. I'm from the UK originally. And so my own country, obviously the trauma of Brexit is a very good example of this retreat from international cooperation. And then I think the third meta trend before COVID is that the systems of international humanitarian aid and development aid, frankly, are designed for a bygone age. they're not designed for an age when the majority of the extreme poor are in fragile and conflict states. They're not designed for an age when the refugees are out of their own homes for 15, 20, 25 years rather than 15, 20 or 25 months. They're not designed for an age when 60% of refugees are in urban areas, not in camps. They're not designed for an age when half of all displaced people are children, yet less than 3% of the world's humanitarian budget goes on education. So you can see the mismatch there of old systems that don't fit the moment. Then you've got COVID. We set 3 priorities in respect of COVID, and in some ways it's enlightened, but I'll then confess why it's not where we're struggling. So number 1, we had to protect our staff. We had to use the lessons of infection prevention and control that we learned in Ebola, in fighting Ebola, to protect our own staff. That's gone pretty well. We've had relatively limited staff illness and absence. Secondly, although there's a whole mental health side of this that's worth talking about, but is not primary. Secondly, we were determined to sustain our health services and march towards the sound of gunfire in this so that they were ready to help people. Actually, we've been underwhelmed by the amount of health coverage we've had to give in response to the narrow question of COVID, but we've got bigger collateral damage on health systems. People are fearful of going to health centers, and in case of measurements of famine and malnutrition, they're more in need of getting to a health center. So that's the second priority we've had. Thirdly, we determined we had to adapt our services for COVID protection. So our education services, our child protection services, our business support services, which were all about bringing people together, we've had to adapt them so that we're not super spreading when we're doing our business. And I'm really proud that we've motored through that, as well as keeping our fundraising going and all the rest of it. What we didn't anticipate and what we didn't mentally prepare for is that the economic collateral damage of COVID and the lockdowns associated with it has been so much greater than expected, and the intergovernmental response has been so much weaker than necessary. The professor will have better figures than I, but some figures, 8, 10, 12, $14 trillion of spending in G20 countries to sustain economic activity within those countries, but relatively speaking, very weak macroeconomic response, whether on debt relief or cash payments or other ways of sustaining economic activity in the poor countries where we work. So sorry for the length of the answer. I'll try and be more Twitter length, but that's, I think, the way I'd try and frame the conversation.
No, it's perfect. And in fact, a number of the things that you raised are things that we're going to dive more deeply into over the course of our discussion. If I could ask one follow-up on COVID, in part because you have such a perspective on COVID and its impact across context, given your work across 40 countries. IRC has a long history of doing work in the public health space. You know, for people living in the United States, many of the folks on this call, you know, we have a particular perspective on what the COVID response has been like. We see the polarization of our politics around the response. We see tremendous debate around the science. We see a lot of resistance to lockdowns and basic social distancing and mask wearing protocols. I wonder if you can offer a perspective as you look across the range of contexts in which IRC does its work. Is the U.S. an outlier with respect to the challenges of mobilizing solidarity in response to the pandemic, or is this something you see playing out in other contexts? And how are you grappling as an institution with the debates around science and practices and protocols and the challenges that this means for freedom and rights?
Well, I'm sorry to say this, but there are a few countries that have made as much of a mess of it as you have. That's the honest truth. I mean, it takes spectacular skill to have record numbers of cases and deaths per million of population and some of the greatest negative economic impact. But that's what the US has contrived to achieve. Now, in the places that we work, we thought 6 months ago the conditions were ripe for total devastation. You've got highly concentrated populations with very weak health infrastructure, and in some cases, desperately weak underlying conditions. But actually, and by the way, practically no testing. So the US is testing at very high levels. In Yemen, in Syria, very low levels of testing. Mexico, very low level, where we're helping Venezuelan refugees, very low. Thailand, very low levels of testing. Ethiopia, very low levels of testing. Sudan, I spoke to our team on Monday, no testing at all. But despite that, the mystery, the dog that hasn't barked in this night, is where's been the health impact of COVID in the places that we work. Now, here's the story. A lot of those countries watched what was happening in Europe and North America in March and went into lockdown before you did. They were quick on the draw. But they couldn't sustain that for more than 4 or 6 weeks. And the economic impact was huge. But what they've discovered since then is that you've got very high asymptomatic spread. It seems that the youth of the population, notably in sub-Saharan Africa, has provided protection. Query, and there isn't great data on this, in northwest Syria, we help people who are outdoors. I mean, they've been driven from their homes. In many of the places we work, the office and never mind nursing home places where you've had this super spreading, that's not the experience in the places that we work. So actually, the immediate health effect has been nowhere near as bad as here. But on the economic front, people, if you're standing on a precipice, you've not got much room to step backwards. And so the inequality that you refer to here of the poorest of America really suffering as a result, both on the health side and the economic side. In the places that we work, the parallel is 70 to 100 million people going into extreme poverty. The UN says up to 450 million people going into relative poverty. And by the way, extreme poverty is less than $1.90 a day. I know you know that, but just for the benefit of the audience. And there's a real sense that the economic impact is now roiling through. What we don't know is what the long-term health impact will be. We don't know if those who've had COVID have their systems weakened in ways that will bite them in 3, 4, 5 years' time.
I can ask one follow-up also on COVID, both wearing your hat as the current IRC president, but also thinking back to your role as foreign secretary in the UK. You talked about the insufficiency of the global response and referenced, in part the insufficiency of the global response with respect to the economic consequences of the pandemic in the global South, not only in more advanced economies. What do you think is required on that front as we move through a period where hopefully we see the pandemic come under control? And it may take longer in the United States than in other places, given the polarized politics that you describe.
Well, Professor Pascaline will have a better idea of what the macroeconomic number is, but the sort of things that I think we have to look at in terms of components of a macroeconomic response. One is around debt relief for countries that are suffering. I think I'm right in saying that there was a write-off of debt payments until December 2020, and maybe an extension of that for 6 months. But essentially, we need to see this pandemic is going endemic, and we've got to think about it over a 3 to 5 year timescale. So I think there's a debt relief part of it. I think there's a lesson in the Western response. What have Western countries done? They've propped up income. They've essentially given cash payments, either directly or German-style Kurzarbeit, 80% of wages. We need to do cash payments to vulnerable populations around the world. We know from our, this about the International Rescue Committee, we're the largest impact evaluation agency in the humanitarian sector, as well as one of the significant deliverers. So we are so hot on outcomes, impact, value for money, the kind of things that the professor and her center are committed to. We know that cash payments are not just empowering, but they're impactful in the way that they meet needs. So I think the cash payments part of this is really significant. And then thirdly, my sense, and I've got to be slightly careful on this because I'm sitting on a World Health Assembly panel on pandemic preparedness and response, and I want to make sure I don't sort of overstep the or get over my skis in terms of the discussions that we're having. But an obvious point is that the world has to do a better job at spotting pandemics, blowing the alarm or blowing the whistle on them, sounding the alarm. It has to fund the WHO properly. It has to fund global health security properly, but it also has to figure out what's the link between a health alarm and a global macroeconomic response. Where are the automatic stabilizers globally, not just nationally? And so I don't have a X% of GDP answer for you, but maybe the professor can come in with that. But I do think there are some components that could help make sure that if you just do the debt relief piece and you don't do the cash payments piece, you're not going to reach the people in need.
Great. Pascaline, do you want to jump in on that question?
I wanted to follow up on another point that David had made about the fact that COVID will likely lead so many people to move into extreme poverty. And I wanted to tie that to a question related to the relationship or the way to think about refugees versus migrants. And in fact, one of the questions we got from the audience was about how many immigrants from the southern hemisphere can the northern hemisphere accommodate? And this is a session on refugees, but immediately the question of immigration comes in, and I think it's always conflated in people's mind. And I wanted to ask you, David, how you think about this issue of when sometimes we have at the back of our mind the definition for refugees, people who cannot safely go home, and there are some migrants who voluntarily left their home country, but they cannot actually go back safely, not because it's not safe at home, but maybe because the way back home is unsafe. And I'm thinking in particular about people who try to cross the Sahel, make it to Libya, and then get stuck there and cannot go further. Many of them, drown in the Mediterranean. Very sadly, some of them don't drown, but then they are stuck in Libya, or they are apprehended on a boat and then taken back to Libya. And I have met some migrants who've managed to make it back all the way to their home countries thanks to some program that help airlifts people out of Libya into their home country. But absent such an intervention, it's impossible for them to make it home. So I would think of them as being unable to go home safely, and it's almost, in my view, kind of like criminal for European governments to take folks on the sea and bring them back to Libya, which is not their home country, where they will be put into slavery or sordid jails and stuff like that. So how do we think about that? Like, does your organization feel a responsibility to deal with this group of individuals? If not, who is in charge of thinking about the ethical issues that this population is?
So that's a very important question, especially in an age of more mixed migration. You've got some people who are forcibly displaced and some people who are more voluntarily displaced. In terms of the narrow question of how we respond on the basis of need, not on the basis of status. And actually, when you think about some of our online platforms, we created an online platform in Greece for people who's called Refugee Info. It was used by 1 million people. Now, we don't know if they are refugees or asylum seekers or migrants, and we don't test them in that way. Cuéntanos is what we've created in El Salvador for people who are on the run. I think it's a really fantastic platform. It's giving 24/7 help to people who, a woman can say, look, I've had to flee a gang. I'm in northern El Salvador. Where is there a safe house for me and my kid? That's a pretty powerful platform, and it's one that governments aren't funding. We've had to fund it through the private sector. Now, the bigger question, though, is more fundamental, and I don't know whether you'll agree with this. I think there is a big difference, morally as well as legally, between someone who is forced from their home and someone, because of their circumstances, who chooses to leave their own home. If you're bombed from your bakery in Damascus, which is the situation of a young family that we resettled in Silver Spring, Maryland, that's different. I'm not saying better or worse, but different from someone who's just decides, look, my prospects here are just no good. I'm going to have to get out. And there's obviously a legal difference in status because there are obligations on states in respect of refugees that don't exist in respect of migrants. Now, I think that both refugees and migrants need entitlements to fair treatment and proper treatment. But I don't think you can be in a situation where you say someone who's forced from their home has got the same rights as someone who is chosen to leave their home. Otherwise, you end up in an impossible situation, because I think the figure that I've got in my head is that there are 750 million people on the move for economic reasons. There are 80 million on the move for geopolitical reasons, in crude terms. Now, that, and I also think the politics of this are that if you confuse, you said conflate rightly, the difference between a refugee and a migrant, it's bad for both groups. I mean, when we came into government in 1997 in the UK, we had a massive asylum backlog from former Yugoslavia, but it completely clouded the whole debate about immigration policy. It's not good for either group to try and merge them together. And I'll try not to go on for too long, but I think it's so important. Nations have international legal responsibilities in respect of refugees that don't exist in respect of migrants. I think you have to defend the position that there should be much less choice about the ability of countries to process asylum claims than about what their immigration policy is. Because a country can choose, we may agree with it or disagree with it, but they can choose to have an immigration policy that's extremely restrictive. There's no international public good that they're required to deliver on. But the hosting of refugees and the processing of asylum claims is an international global public good. It needs to be upheld. Now, final point, a lot of the cases are very in the grey area. You know, someone who's, when climate change forces someone off the land, I mean, I don't, we can come back to that in the questions later, but I think if you don't start from a clear and principled position about the difference, you end up in a terrible mess.
Well, let me take your starting point that we should preserve this distinction and just ask you, for the population for which there is international legal obligation, refugees and asylum seekers, how do you see the challenges in the present moment? We have a president in the United States that has almost zeroed out the refugee resettlement program in comparison to his predecessors. Aside from Germany, we have a set of European countries that have often walked away from their obligations under the Refugee Convention as we dealt with the flows from Syria. Do you think the convention itself can be rescued, and what will it take to rescue the convention? Because international law is only meaningful if people follow it. Right? There's no enforcement mechanism.
The biggest problem with the convention is the politics, not the policy. The problem is not inherent in the convention. And frankly, opening up the convention is likely to lead to less rights for refugees, not more rights, never mind the impracticality of 190 countries coming to any kind of agreement. So I would caution very strongly against reopening the convention. What it's shown itself to be since 1951 is pretty flexible. In 1951, the idea that if you were a woman on the run from domestic violence, you'd have been granted refugee status, people said no, but actually the administrative law has developed in a quite a flexible and effective way, and countries like Germany have shown that the US experience of taking 3 or 4, at the moment, if you cross the border and claim asylum, leave to one side the Remain in Mexico policy, but the US is taking 3 or 4 years to process an asylum claim. There's no reason for that, other than bureaucratic and political mess. Now, I think that the biggest issue, though, is one that the Professor Pascaline hinted at earlier, which is that most refugees, 86%, are in poor countries, not in rich countries. They're delivering on this global public good. They're not putting up walls. If you go to northern Uganda, there isn't a wall between South Sudan and Uganda. But they're not getting much help from the international system. Some people sort of sneer about the European support for Turkey. But actually, Turkey's been hosting 3.7 million refugees. They should get international help. They're obviously a richer country than Uganda. But I think that there's obviously an issue that personally and institutionally, the reduction in the US refugee program hurts the US from 90,000 refugees in 2016 to 15,000 refugees, 12,000 this year. That's hurting refugees and it's hurting the US. And Vice President Biden said he wants to reverse that and go back to 125,000 refugees. Ronald Reagan admitted more refugees to America than any other American president, 210,000 in 1981. But that's, and European countries should have a route to safety. There's terrible things going on in the Channel between France and Britain at the moment. And that means that we can't, and they're denying a legal route to hope. And so I think that that the big agenda at the moment is really about supporting refugee hosting states. And that's, I think, a big agenda of geopolitical stability.
One other dimension that you kind of, suggested would make this complex problem even harder to address is climate. And so I want to bring up climate explicitly. It came also in a question from the audience. Climate change is likely the most important strategic issue for every country in the world in the medium to long term. And we have a set of political challenges that also stand in the way of addressing this problem. And climate change is already causing a set of challenges for the humanitarian community, not only through the channel of movement, but also in terms of just the direct consequences of natural disasters that we've seen around the world. So when you think about climate being on the horizon as a potential driver of migration, how does that change your thinking about this clear line that you were drawing between those who are forced from their homes by virtue of violence or threat and those who are choosing to move in terms of economic opportunity? How can the world get ahead of the moment that we know we're headed for in terms of building the kind of political space that we need to deal with climate-induced consequences for people's livelihoods and well-being?
Well, we've just been through a strategy process at the International Rescue Committee, and we've rewritten or slightly amended our mission statement, which talks about helping people whose lives are shattered by conflict or disaster survive, recover, and gain control of their lives. And we've now added in a climate crisis dimension to this. And that's more than symbolic. That is substantive. It will affect the way we do our economic programming, for example. Now, here's the thing. Climate is a conflict multiplier through the impact on resource stress. And conflict is obviously a humanitarian crisis driver. But interestingly enough, most people who are affected by climate change stay within their own country. They're climate IDPs, internally displaced, not climate refugees. And so I think that the issue, at least for the moment, is about how countries are helped to adapt to climate change, as well as the time the richer countries mitigate it. I don't want to blow off the question, but I think that I don't think it's an arrow at this question of the convention and what it does or doesn't include. I do take the point that at some point there'll need to be some reconciliation about the issue of what about people who are quote unquote forced from their homes. Another way of turning it, I think Pascaline said this, the best definition of a refugee is someone for whom it's not safe to go home. And what safe means then, I think becomes relevant. It's not clear to me though, I stand to be corrected by someone may know this, you may have done some studies on this. I don't see that it's going to become it's not obvious to me that climate drives people across borders. And that, I think, speaks to a different set of issues about how adaptation and mitigation is supported.
We had a question from the audience reacting to what you said earlier about the importance of cash transfers, especially in this time of COVID, as a way to support refugees. And I guess the question was like, how sure are we that cash transfers are a good tool at the moment? Because if markets are closed, if the economies are not doing great, if there is not much food to buy to start with, won't cash transfer possibly exacerbate price inflation and things like that, versus in-kind transfers in the form of providing food aid or making sure that people have access to health services, maybe setting up schools. These are like more concrete, tangible things that we can see the downstream effects directly, whereas cash, we don't know exactly how they're going to be used. So how do you think about cash transfers versus in-kind, more traditional in-kind transfer, and does the current moment change the equation?
Yeah, I mean, our experience is that trying to decide as a group of bureaucrats or ex-politicians or even professors what other people should have or should be spent on is a fool's errand. Secondly, the loss that comes from the loss of value that comes from the whole process of trying to decide for people and then purchase for people and then transport for people way overwhelms any inflation impact. Thirdly, we do actually know what people spend on. They spend on their basic needs, especially in female-headed households. The same fear that is attached to welfare payments in America that is applied to poor people around the world. And there's absolutely no evidence that the money doesn't get spent on the most important things. Now, for one family, that might include pencils. It might include shoes for kids. In another family, it might include firewood. But it's so much better for them to decide than for us to try and decide, not just in a kind of high-minded empowerment conversation, but in actually a value for money conversation, because we have a lot of experience of countries that have tried to decide, well, this population needs a lot of tents, let's do that. The value, by the time you've taken your $100 or $1 million for tents and seen how much value actually reaches people at the front line, it's way denuded compared to the impact of cash transfers. And there's a lot of good microeconomic evidence about it.
Maybe I can ask you to expand a little bit on some of what's beneath your comments on cash transfers. One of the big agendas that you brought to IRC when you took over a number of years ago was to really focus the humanitarian sector on innovation and results, to really take a hard look at the traditional strategies of delivery and to hold yourselves accountable given the enormous flows of funds that are passing through organizations like the IRC for really delivering meaningful improvements and outcomes for people. And that's been a part of a revolution in the way that development has been done over the last decade or two. I partly want you to reflect on kind of 5 years of pushing that agenda in the humanitarian sector and ask you, what's hard about doing it in the humanitarian sector, especially a sector that's so focused on meeting needs? Have you really found openness to it, and where have you found resistance? And what do you point to as where you think you've effectively been able to move the needle? That is, are there things that you were doing that you've determined really just don't make sense, and you're ready to set aside those old ways of doing business? And are there new strategies that you've uncovered that really move the needle in far more effective ways than we were operating in the past?
Yeah, I mean, it's been much harder, I think, to push the outcome. I lost you at the beginning. You're asking about outcomes and evidence, Jeremy, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been harder to push the outcomes and evidence agenda than I expected. If anyone listening can type into their computer IRC outcomes and evidence framework, they'll see what our country directors see. There are 5 outcomes: survival, health, education, income, and power of the beneficiary. There are 26 sub-outcomes because mental health is different from maternal health. And you'll see a theory of change for each of those sub-outcomes, and you'll see the current state of the evidence base, generally and in humanitarian settings. And in the gaps, we decide on our research priorities because we need to fill the gaps. Now, here's the thing. We've got a donor community that they all want to have their own outcome definition. And when there's political turnover, they get refined. That's been a big problem across the Western donor. There's insufficient donor cooperation. The commitments that the UN system made around transparency, that they've been dealing with so many crises, it's been very hard to get the kind of clarity, even with the Sustainable Development Goal framework. There are I've been arguing that you need to have targets for displaced populations in the 4 key areas of the Sustainable Development Goals: health, education, income, and women's protection, women's empowerment, gender equality. And without those accountability metrics, I think it's very hard to get progress. So we've made less progress on this agenda than I would have liked externally. Internally, I'm incredibly proud. I mean, every program we run now is geared towards an outcome. Every country program chooses signature outcomes and core outcomes. Our research and development, now called Research and Innovation Department, has won a lot of support. We could do with more, frankly. But our research priorities around malnutrition, sexual and reproductive health, maternal health and newborn health, education have really yielded some serious innovation in some surprising areas. And we've changed our practice a bit. I mean, the why not cash philosophy has made a difference. We're now introducing why not partner because of the importance of local community-based organizations for sustainable change. The way we deal with child protection, moving from community-based services to family-based services is interesting. The emphasis on community health workers as being capacitated to take on malnutrition, that's a change as a result of our evidence making. So I feel our emergency programming is geared in a different way because of our research innovation. So we've made more progress internally than I expected, less progress externally.
So one commonly asked question in this discussion is whether the camp model has any place at all beyond just like a few months, because in terms when people immediately leave their home, they need a shelter, they need a place where they can, sleep and be fed. But the idea that anybody would spend 17 years in a camp, which is the average time people spend in a camp, is definitely not what we think of when we think of like providing immediate relief to refugees. So what's the way forward here? Like, how can we think about camps as being just like a very temporary thing to help people, but then obviously integration into the kind of like normal, if I may say, labor market and life, in a host country, they cannot go back home. Is that something that we need to push for, that you can push for, that the IRC is making a progress on? Because if not, then how do we deal with the fact that as people age in a camp, people are born in a camp and age in a camp, a lot of issues need to be taken care of, non-communicable diseases, aging, all of these things. This is a question that also Michel Berry had.
Look, I mean, here's the tragic thing. A lot of these camps are set up as temporary. I mean, the Dadaab refugee camp in Western Kenya was set up as a temporary camp for people from Somalia. And 25 years later, it's still there. That's why I wrote a short book 3 years ago called Rescue Refugees and the Political Crisis of Our Time. I've learned in America that it's okay to advertise one's own books, and it's not considered bad form. Available from all good booksellers and with a donation to IRC for every copy we sell. I said there that the refugee camps are often funeral homes for dreams. And I think that as you think about the difficulty of ending civil wars, the most likely outcome of a civil war, peace settlement, is another civil war. You've got to think about how you make local integration possible. And that depends on taking on the fiction that people are going to go home, because it's a fiction. But it means also taking on the fiction among the aid and international finance community that these countries can be expected just to put people up without any support or without sufficient support. And so the sort of bargain that I described in my book with the refugee hosting states is largely founded on the idea that you've got to make refugee integration attractive. And that's a big ask. That's a very big ask, because there are all sorts of tensions and issues there. But it's got to be, until we can make it really worth the while of the refugee hosting states, we're going to end up with the camps being left. And you do have very depressing stories. Interestingly enough, healthcare in camps is often better than the healthcare outside the camp, because they're often in poor areas of the country. But nonetheless, your basic point is a good one. And but there's got to be a big macroeconomic carrot to make it worthwhile, because we're talking about Bangladesh, we're talking about Uganda, we're talking about country, we're talking about Lebanon or Jordan, where Lebanon 25% of the population. You've got to make it worth their while.
So a number of our audience members are asking how they can contribute, how they can help, and a number of questions on that and asking about how they can help in different dimensions. So let me try to kind of like bring them together. So one person was asking how they can, what can we do in order to help advocate for debt relief? Another person was trying to get a sense for what it means to work for the IRC. Who are the people that you have on the ground? What their background, for how long do they work with you, and where do they come from? And then we also have one of our King supporters, actually, Nushin Hashemi, who's through the HAND Foundation, has been also supporting the IRC for many years. And she's asking, what are the areas for which the IRC right now needs most support? So
Great.
you can, three questions into one.
Look, I mean, in the end, debt relief is negotiated intergovernmentally. And until governments are willing to address that, in more support for international financial institutions and then enlightened policies by them, we're really struggling. And you probably know more about that than I do. The IMF is trying to be active. The World Bank has expanded its mandate to include refugee hosting states in a good way. But there isn't a debt relief initiative specifically attached to refugee hosting. I suggest in my book that there should be. In terms of our own staff, look, we recruit mainly locally. I mean, our staff in Syria are Syrian, our staff in Somalia are Somali. I spoke yesterday to our staff in Ethiopia. I mean, in very large numbers. In Afghanistan, we have 1,100 staff, and I think 6 are international staff. The first thing is, whoever is asking, how do I work for the IRC? It depends where they live and where they're from. Because if they're, we hire locally. Equally, there are global functional specialists who we want to support, and who we need to support, and who we value. And obviously in the US, we have this network of 25 refugee resettlement agencies. We're the largest refugee resettlement agency in the US, as well as the #1 rated. And if there is a change of administration, and President Biden, candidate Biden, President Biden, if he wins, if he then ramps up the refugee resettlement numbers to 125,000, which he's promised, then we'll be expanding our work in the US. We have 5 offices in California, some in Northern California, not in Palo Alto, I'm afraid, but Oakland, I think, is probably the nearest to you, which is not that far away. We're obviously recruiting people who can provide pastoral care, provide English language, provide legal support, provide buddying for kids, provide employment opportunities, because we know that getting people into employment, they get 3 months of housing support, but they need to get into work. We run a car loan scheme, because in America you need a car, it turns out. There's important social and economic work at the ground level. Thank you very much to the HAND Foundation. I'm very happy to give a shout out to them for their support. That's very good to hear. It's much needed. People think that because we're an $800 million organization, $1 million doesn't make a difference. Private support is our risk capital. It's our innovation fund. It's our unpopular causes fund. It's our beyond the headlines fund. And it's our emergency fund, because governments are being slow on emergencies. We get $600 million from our government supporters and $200 million from our individual foundation and private supporters. But flexible money that allows us to deploy to meet our priorities, which are all set out in terms of tackling inequalities of women and girls, reaching hard to reach people. And that's where the money goes. And that's where we're really grateful for support.
David, if I can take a step back from the specifics of our conversation to some of the issues that you framed in your first response about the moment that we find ourselves in geopolitically. You've been at the center of what people call the international community. You've been a part of the international community as a representative of your government. You've been a part of the international community as a representative of a humanitarian organization. But you also spoke to the fact that the international community, as it has been defined in the period since World War II, is suffering a lot of stress, is fractured in various ways that we haven't seen in recent years. You used the word outmatched by the current challenges. Other people refer to the international institutions that we have as out of date. What does that really mean from where you sit? And what do you think as you look at the changing politics both in Europe and the United States, the emergence of China, which is far more assertive on the international stage than they were even 5 years ago? What does it mean for actually addressing the kind of geopolitical issues that are the causes of the humanitarian crises that IRC needs to respond to? What needs to happen on that front?
Well, that's a very, very big question. I mean, I think that we have to confine it a bit. I mean, there were really 2 parts to what you were saying: what's happening and what needs to change. I think that maybe the best example of what's happening would be to look at WHO. The US has pulled out of the WHO formally. It's will run through till next July. China has doubled down. The US reason for pulling out was too much Chinese influence, but of course pulling out can only lead to more Chinese influence. I think that that's a good, it's an incredibly potent symbol at the time of a global pandemic for a breaking up of an international system that was underpowered and under-resourced rather than overpowerful and over-resourced. And there are less stark examples, but they're real. And sometimes they involve national interests, but not always. I mean, you can say that national interests and geopolitical competition are at issue in the divisions on the Security Council on Syria, or even conceivably on Yemen, but they're not on South Sudan. And so I think that there is the fracturing has a number of causes, but it's very serious. Now, the danger, maybe I'll answer this in three parts. That's the situation. The danger is that we embrace, in my view, this is a personal opinion, that the China question, if I can put it that way, becomes framed in a new Cold War style view. That the simplicities of 10 or 15 years ago, when people talked about a G2, a group of two, and that was wrong for various reasons. If that's replaced by, well, there's a Cold War and either you're with us or against us, and every issue now is hostage to that Cold War, then I think we're in a really dangerous place. So that's one reason that the next period is so critical. My own view on this, thirdly, is what needs to be done is I think you start by thinking multilaterally, and so taking issues like health and issues like climate and thinking what are the multilateral instruments, but critically, and here I owe a debt to Pascaline Dupas, the former head of the WTO, who may well have been a speaker in your series, or in your, so I'm sure he's been to Stanford. I mean, he talks about a polylateral system, not just a multilateral system. Polylateral in the sense it's not just relations between nations, it's relations between civil society, business, universities. And it's interesting, if you think about the COVID crisis in a polylateral sense, not just a multilateral sense, the scientific community and in some ways the business community has rallied to cooperate internationally, much more so certainly than the intergovernmental community. Now, those aren't the most difficult issues, but the truth about cybersecurity, the truth about AI is that you need rules of the road that include the Chinese and the Americans and the Europeans and others, that rather than have a bifurcated system. But that's a very political choice, and it's a very geopolitical choice.
Can I ask you a question about being in government versus working, as an NGO? What are the main advantages and disadvantages of both, since you've been in both situations? And do you think that it's currently becoming increasingly difficult to do work as an NGO, given how governments are dealing with issues of migration and refugees themselves? Does it constrain what you can do? And related to that, there's a question from the audience about how the financial structure that you have in an NGO also may matter for what you can do in terms of accountability. So you're accountable to different people, whether you're in government or an NGO, and how does that also play into this different? Yeah,
that's interesting. I mean, look, it's simple in some ways. You have much less power if you're running an NGO than if you're running a government department. I mean, just be absolutely blunt about it. But there are fewer obstacles to getting anything done. You've got more people trying to help you get something done rather than stop you getting something done. So it's a power versus obstacles. And so in an NGO, you've got less power but fewer obstacles. In government, you've got more power but more obstacles. I mean, that's sort of, I don't want to be glib about it, but that's the basic. You could construct a course at Stanford about that trade-off. Probably there is one. I think that I think secondly, I don't think the political, I think it's got to be really careful when we talk about anti-refugee and nationalist. We shouldn't talk ourselves into a kind of tiny minority. I mean, I don't believe, in fact, the evidence in America, we take the polling, the evidence is not viciously anti-refugee. I mean, if anything, the administration is out of step with the population. It's changed though since 2015, 2016. So I think the fact, though, that governments are focused on their own problems, not global problems, means that NGOs, private sector, foundations, universities need to be offering some leadership. You need government leadership, you need NGO business, academic innovation, you need mass mobilization to solve big problems, but you don't necessarily need them in that order. Sometimes the mobilization comes first, sometimes the innovation comes first, and then government comes in behind. And I don't think we should be slave to the idea that if governments don't lead, no one can lead. So that makes it a good time to be in an NGO in some ways. And then thirdly, in terms of the accountability, look, our accountability, I'm afraid, is all upwards to donors. I'd like to have more accountability downwards to clients. But that we've got to persuade the donors that the accountability should be to the clients. But that's a hard one.
I want to, as a last question, just as we come to the end, obviously there's an important election coming up in the United States, and many of us are focused on it and wondering what the consequences are, both domestically and internationally. So I want to ask you to play the role of a bit of a futurist, which I know isn't a fair task. I'm not going to ask you who's going to win, but really just to help to help us think about how the world responds to the outcome of this election. That if President Trump is reelected, how do you see things playing out in the international community of states more broadly, both from the perspective of Europe, but also China? And what does the world look like if Joe Biden wins on the international stage, given the really challenging issues that you've raised for us to consider today?
Look, we're a non-political organization. It's important to say that, whatever our personal views. So here's my dispassionate view of it. I mean, whether you agree with him or disagree with him, President Trump has done what he promised. He promised that he would abjure international alliances, international entanglements, that he would make others pay for things rather than pay for themselves, that he'd rip up trade deals, that he'd pull out of the Paris Climate Accord, that he'd nix the Iran nuclear deal. So he's done what he promised. And that says to me that you should take him literally. And so if you look forward to a second Trump term, I think you have to take literally the promises and the pledges and the instincts that he's enumerated in respect of NATO, in respect of confrontation with China, in respect of a more transactional approach and a more bilateral approach to international affairs. It's important to remember that in the first months of the administration, the first National Security Advisor, McMaster, and Gary Cohn, then Director of International Economics, they wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal saying, look, just be clear, there's no such thing as the international community. There's a ring for rivalry, but there's no international community, which is, I think, a phrase that you used in an earlier question. And I think that they were channeling the views of the president. So we should take him seriously and literally on that. On the vice president's side, I think that the key question there is more open, which is if restoration of a pre-2017 status quo ante is not really viable, what does reinvention mean for the global system? These are not my words. As you know, I can see from you nodding, Jeremy, you know that Bill Burns wrote an important piece in Foreign Affairs where he framed this choice. And I think that from my reading of the Biden thinking, that he recognizes that restoration is not good enough because the pre-2017 system wasn't working well enough, even if it were possible to turn the clock back. So then the question is, well, what does reinvention mean? What does it mean to have a different kind of WHO that is polylateral as well as multilateral? What does it mean to have a Western world that is united and organized, not to confront China, but to compete and negotiate with China? What does it mean to take seriously regional institution building in South America, in the Middle East, etc.? Those reinvention questions are, I think, the questions that will define whether or not a Biden administration is seen as successful or not. And since this is the last question, it's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you for welcoming me to the Stanford community. I actually came to Stanford in 2012 to teach. You call it 0 week, don't you, in Stanford? Condoleezza Rice and I, we were opposite numbers in the in government in 2007-8. And we came obviously from slightly different points on the political spectrum, but we taught a 0 week course to really brilliant students in the business school and in one of the departments about, there were 5 case studies of diplomacy in action, and I got a sense of the vibrancy of the Stanford community. So thank you very much for the interesting questions today. For anyone who's interested in learning more about the International Rescue Committee, which you did promise me at the beginning that this meeting was full of incredibly generous donors. So if you go to www.rescue.org, you can find out all about the work that we're doing, the research studies that we've talked about, and employment opportunities for someone who are interested in that. And it would be great if the conversation was taken forward in that way.
Well, thank you so much. We've reached the end of our time, but I'm extremely grateful, David, for the time you've given us, also for all the work that you're doing at the IRC. I very much hope we can welcome you on campus again soon. Anytime if you want to come and teach again, we'd be more than happy to make that happen. It's always so inspiring to get a chance to engage on such important issues with such thoughtful leaders. So thank you. And thank you to Jeremy for leading the discussion and for making the introduction to David for the King Center. And many thanks to Leslie Murray at the King Center, who's been essentially making this event happen. Thank you to our audience for really great questions. I'm apologizing for not being able to manage to ask all of them, but we'll try to make sure we keep a record of the questions and share them with David for follow-up. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
And have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.